Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the works of Amy Orr-Ewing. In this video, I will continue my examination of her book, Is Believing in God Irrational?, by looking at chapters 6 through 8. So let's get started with a look at chapter 6. If Christianity is about a transforming relationship with God, why are Christians so bad? Well, the question asked in the title of this chapter is an important one, Orr-Ewing writes, because many critics of Christianity cite the hypocrisy and the questionable character of some Christians as evidence that their life-changing encounters with Christ only actually happened in their imaginations. Quote, "The first thing I would say in response to this objection is that Christians are often the first to admit that we haven't got it all together, or at least we ought to be. When we do fail to live out our faith, we must recognize that this is a serious matter. However, this should not discourage a skeptic from at least taking a look, first and foremost, at Christ. I may not be the best example of a Christian, but please don't let that stop you from seeing Christ for yourself." Here's the thing, though. Skeptics who ask Christians for evidence of the power of Christ are often pointed toward his reputed ability to supernaturally transform the lives of people who enter into a relationship with him. To my fellow atheists watching this, how many times have you asked a Christian why they believe Christ is real? And they respond that they know he's real because he transformed them after they found their faith. Christ made them a new person. He made them gentler and more generous, more loving, more content, more whatever. And how many times has this testimony been followed by an invitation to ask Jesus to show himself to you? The experience of Jesus is touted as the most compelling evidence of the truth of Christianity, and key to that experience is its transformative nature. Being transformed through Christ is part of many people's definition of a Christian, including Amy Orr-Ewing, who writes, quote, "Christians are not those who try to do good things, but those who have received forgiveness and grace from God in Christ and are transformed by knowing him." So, by pointing skeptics to Christians who say they've been transformed by their relationship with Christ, but also explaining away hypocritical or immoral Christians by saying they just haven't got it all together because they're only imperfect humans after all, it seems to me that Orr-Ewing is asking us to count the hits and ignore the misses. Christians who found their faith at a low point in their lives and have since turned everything around should be considered evidence of Christ's grace and power. But Christians who are still struggling or who lie and cheat and steal, well, they're just evidence of the sad frailty and sinful nature of humanity. They don't count at all against the reliability of Christianity. This is also an example of another popular tactic of apologists and evangelists, giving God all the credit and giving humanity all the blame. Did your life improve and did you become a better person after converting to Christianity? Well, praise the Lord. Are you still miserable and suffering or just kind of a bastard years after giving your life to Christ? Well, you poor, broken, sinful child. God can only help you if you truly want to be helped. See, the good stuff is always God. The bad stuff is never God's fault, which is not the worst arrangement if you're God or someone who sells God for a living. When you do encounter a Christian who doesn't seem to be a shining example of the transforming power of Christ, Orr-Ewing recommends that you consider the possibilities. This Christian may just be at the beginning of their walk with Christ, and they may not have had time for all that much change to take place. Or they may have experienced Christ's life-changing power, but then they recently had a slip-up. They made a mistake. They gave in to temptation, did something that let others down and let themselves down, and presumably let God down too. These things happen because becoming a Christian doesn't make someone perfect. Let us remember the example of Peter, one of the closest disciples of Jesus in the New Testament, who denied him 3 times. Or perhaps this so-called Christian isn't a true believer in Christ at all. Maybe they profess Christianity, but they haven't truly given their lives to Christ. So like I said, count the hits, ignore the misses. Christians have been failing to live up to their own standards since before they were called Christians. The Bible itself is filled with examples of God's chosen people, prophets, disciples, etc., screwing up big time. Orr-Ewing says, quote, "When Christians fail spectacularly, it is human weakness reasserting itself. The reality of God's transforming power is all the more necessary when the raw material of human lives is examined. The church is made of broken people on a journey to wholeness. Perfection is not expected overnight, but transformation of lives will be happening where Christ is genuinely at work." So it's not just count the hits and ignore the misses. It's count the hits and count the misses as hits. Because when Christians fail, why, that's just evidence that they need God's grace and mercy and power of transformation even more. What hypothetical evidence could there be that would disprove what Orr-Ewing is saying? Because that's always the mark of a good argument. A good argument is not unfalsifiable. A good argument, even if you believe you're right and you have a very persuasive case, you should still be able to propose some circumstance or some hypothetical evidence that could prove you wrong were it to be discovered, were it to be brought to bear. What is that evidence for this argument that Amy Orr-Ewing is making? Because what she's saying is, if Christians prosper and become wonderful people, well, that is evidence that God is working in their lives. If Christians stumble, well, that's just evidence that their human weaknesses are still able to take control from time to time. And if someone becomes a Christian and doesn't seem to change at all, well, that's evidence that they weren't actually a Christian in the first place. That sure sounds like an unfalsifiable argument to me. Orr-Ewing emphasizes the role played by the church to build communities and help all of these imperfect, broken Christians live their lives to the fullest as they grow and change and transform and become the people God wants them to be. She closes out this chapter with this, quote, "We should not be too quick to write off churches as hypocritical or failing in some way before examining our own hearts and motives. It was the great London preacher Charles Spurgeon who is reported to have said, 'If you find the perfect church, don't join. You'll only spoil it.'" There's some of that classic Christian humility. And while we're on that subject, that's something that has bothered me about certain areas of Christianity for quite a while. It's that willingness, even eagerness of some Christians to confess their own sins. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be willing to face and take responsibility for our own shortcomings. Of course we should, and I dare say most of us could stand to do that a lot more often and a lot more honestly, myself most definitely included. But there's just something unseemly about the way some Christian churches teach people to revel in what they're taught to regard as their own brokenness. If Jesus can help me, he can surely help you, the story goes, because let me tell you, friend, I was the worst of the worst. How many evangelists have made that pitch? If Jesus can help me, he can help you, because I was just scum. I was so unworthy of God's love. I was the lowest form of life you could imagine. I lied and cheated and stole and betrayed. I was an addict. I was a bum. I cheated on my spouse. I beat my kids. I stole from my job, whatever. List all of the indiscretions you can possibly imagine. I was the worst human being ever. Jesus was able to help me. And if he can help me, he can help you. I don't even recall how many times I've heard some version of that story from Christian evangelists. How many disgraced preachers or other Christian public figures have made a spectacle of themselves by confessing to their misdeeds and begging for the forgiveness of God, their family, the general public as in as abject a manner as possible. Remember, those of you who are old enough to remember the Jimmy Swaggart scandal, remember when he went back on TV after his indiscretions had been revealed, and he cried and he begged God and his family and his congregation and his television audience for forgiveness. Oh, talk about a guy who was able to make something work for him. Jimmy Swaggart grabbed that and took that as an opportunity. He wasn't going to allow himself to be disgraced. Oh no, he was going to show all those Christians how it's done. When your sins are revealed to the entire world, here's how you take that and you turn that around and you make it work for you. Now, it's not all Christians that do this, certainly. It's not all churches that behave in this way. But there is an element within Christianity that seems to almost fetishize what they perceive as their low, unworthy state, especially if they engage in particularly bad behavior. And hey, you know what? If that's what makes them feel good, more power to them. Just don't ever let me catch them kink-shaming someone else who gets off on something different, okay? To each their own, please. Now, chapter 7 is next, and that is titled, If God is so loving and relational, why did he go ahead and create when he knew people would end up in hell? Now that is an excellent question. Orr-Ewing describes the flippant modern attitude toward the idea of hell and the gasps of astonishment that greeted a sermon from Pope Benedict in 2007 when he declared that hell was still real, even if no one really talks about it like that anymore. She then writes of how she was asked about hell by a university student who was, as Orr-Ewing puts it, quite agitated at the possibility of being held to account after death for actions in this life. Well, I'm pretty sure it's not just a generic objection to accountability that the student was making there. Being held accountable for your actions is one thing. Being forced to endure an eternity of suffering for your actions is quite another thing. Christians often dismiss criticism of the concept of hell as simply non-believers refusing to accept any system that holds them accountable, ignoring completely the fact that in their religion, accountability means being tormented for the rest of time. There must be a middle ground between total lack of accountability and eternal damnation. Mustn't there? Apparently not, because the omnipotent God who created the universe couldn't find it. It was apparently one or the other for him. And lucky us, he chose the eternal damnation option. But what about that question? Why did God create people when he knew some of them would go to hell? Quote, the emotive force of this question makes it very powerful. Surely, if God really cared about people, it would be better not to have made them, if he knew full well that many would enter an eternal destiny of suffering. The problem with the question is that it assumes that it is possible to make a like-for-like comparison between existence and non-existence, and then go on to conclude that one is preferable to or better than the other. Okay, that's a good point. It is difficult to compare existence to non-existence in order to determine if one is preferable to the other, given that we exist. And of those two states, existence is the only one we will ever experience because non-existence isn't experienced. That's the whole point. But I don't think that's the problem with the why did God create people if he knew some would go to hell question. Actually, I don't think the problem is with the question. The problem is with how Amy Orr-Ewing frames the answer. If God is truly all-powerful, then surely he had more options than create people and have some of them go to hell, or don't create any people. Why was the creation of hell a necessity alongside the creation of people? Why could God, the all-powerful, have not created people, but simply not created hell? And why must hell be eternal punishment? Orr-Ewing will argue throughout this chapter that a loving God is consistent with a God who punishes. And that is not the problem with the concept of hell. Again, there is the attempt to conflate eternal punishment and accountability. If a loving God saw fit to set some rules for existence and to punish people who broke those rules, that in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. The problems become evident when we start to examine the Christian versions of what those rules are, how people are made aware or aren't that those are the rules, and what the punishment for breaking those rules is. Orr-Ewing segues into a discussion of justice. Our feelings about justice depend on which side of the law we find ourselves. She says most people are supportive of the legal system in principle and are particularly enthusiastic about it when they are victims of crimes who want justice for themselves. But when they are the accused, well, their feelings can be quite different. Justice is a very important thing, she writes, and therefore a loving God cannot ignore injustice. A loving God must be a just God. Punishment for a wrongdoing is an essential part of justice, she writes. Quote, wrongdoing must be recognized as such by both the perpetrator and the world around. That is the function of punishment. Not that petty rivalries and scores are settled in revenge. Rather, justice requires that when a line is crossed, consequences follow. Hell is the ultimate degree of this. It is the destination of those who refuse to recognize their own sin for what it is, whose assertion of the self over others and God defies divine justice. Hell is the ultimate consequence of egoism. Even here we've got the God gets the credit, we get the blame. Hell is the ultimate punishment, which is terrible for the people who go there, but it's ultimately their fault. Not the fault of the God who set the rules of the universe and created hell in the first place, somehow. So what about the issue of proportionality? Is it really fair to damn someone's soul for eternity as a consequence of something they did during their brief earthly life? Well, Amy Orr-Ewing, probably not surprisingly for most of you, thinks so. For one thing, the experience of hell won't be the same for everyone, and there is biblical evidence for this, Orr-Ewing says. For instance, in the book of Mark, Jesus says that people who enjoy the comforts that go along with being a member of the religious authorities while taking advantage of the poor will receive greater damnation. Orr-Ewing takes this to mean that the punishment we receive in hell will be a reflection of how we lived our lives on earth. On the other hand, as Thomas Aquinas said, God is an infinite being, and therefore any transgressions against him must be punished infinitely. So, punishment in hell is infinite. Hell is infinite punishment. But depending on how bad you were in your life or what particular sins you committed, your infinite punishment might not be as bad as someone else's infinite punishment. I'm not the one who quoted Thomas Aquinas in the book, she is. The Bible makes it clear that God takes sin very seriously, so seriously, in fact, that he was only able to forgive it after suffering and dying on the cross himself as Christ. And Christ's death on the cross was an act of expiation, meaning that he took the sins of all the world upon himself, and also an act of propitiation, meaning that he absorbed the rightful punishment for that sin that he took upon himself. Quote, all this demonstrates how serious sin is, since God himself paid such a price. The cross means that no one has to end up in hell and that forgiveness is offered to all. But forgiveness must be received. And for this, a recognition of sin is essential. The astonishing thing in the Christian worldview is that God, who loves the world, shows mercy by coming into the world that he has made and pays the price of the cross, and still people end up in hell. Well, Jesus was dead and presumably bearing the punishment for sin for what, 3 days, max? So the infinite God has to punish others for their sins infinitely because, hey, infinite God, sorry, those are the rules. But when God decides to take that punishment upon himself, he figures, 3 days and I'll be good. What price did God pay? Because, someone could say, well, God is infinite, God is timeless, so he was able to experience an eternity in hell in what for us would have been 3 days. So see, I got you that one. Checkmate, atheist. But what price did God really pay? Because even if he experienced somehow an infinity, an eternity of hell in what on earth was 3 days, the price humans pay for sin is eternity in hell, as in they never get to leave. Humans who go to hell lose everything forever. God is still God. Even the physical death of Jesus was reversed when he was resurrected. What consequences did God suffer from the death of Christ on the cross? And how twisted is it to ask people concerned about the prospect of people suffering for eternity in hell to instead direct their sympathies to the all-powerful God who took human form, died, stayed dead for 3 of our days, and then came back to life? If Christianity is true, there are people, helpless people, suffering in hell, and they will suffer there forever. Their suffering will never stop. But Amy Orr-Ewing says, yeah, but the person you should feel really bad for is God, because he loved us so much that he went to hell for a little bit and bore the punishment of sin temporarily, and then went back to being God. And he did all that, and there are still people who don't appreciate him and don't take advantage of his generous offer, and they still go to hell. So see, God's the one you should really feel bad for, not all those helpless people suffering in hell forever. God in this scenario is like the equivalent of the clueless American college student who spends a few months in India in like a student exchange program or some kind of work-study program, and comes back home and is convinced that now they understand poverty as well as anyone. Now, I'm sure that such an experience changes you, hopefully for the better. It would be absurd to assume that it wouldn't, but it would be far more absurd to assume that because of your temporary trip to India, after which you returned to your comfortable American college student life, you know just as much about poverty as the people who are actually living in that inescapable indigence every day of their lives. If God thinks he took on the full punishment for sin because he spent 3 days in hell, he's a poser and a fraud. His prescribed punishment for sin, for us, for humans, is not 3 days in hell. It's forever in hell. Jesus was resurrected and back to running the universe before the end of his book. And sorry, that just doesn't count. Now, before I move on to the next chapter, let me address another line from that quote where Orr-Ewing says that the amazing thing about Christianity is that God paid the price for our sin for us, and still people end up in hell. I mean, can you believe that? The implication being, what more is God supposed to do? He died on the cross, took the punishment for our sin, for the sake of argument. So if we're still going to refuse his offer of forgiveness and salvation, it's really on us, right? Not on him. He's done his part. What else is he supposed to do? Is that how it is, though? Is that at all a fair assessment of the situation? God chose, for reasons known only to himself, that he has never chosen to share with anyone, to become a human and allow himself to be publicly executed because somehow that was the best way to enable him to forgive people's sins and spare them from hell. But in order for people to take advantage of God's merciful act of sacrifice, they have to willingly accept it. Salvation is opt-in for some reason, not opt-out, which would have made a lot more sense if your goal is to save as many people as possible. So why is that? Well, Orr-Ewing writes that forgiveness must be accepted. But see, I don't buy that. It's nice if forgiveness is accepted, if you forgive somebody and the person you're forgiving says, oh, thank you very much, that means a lot to me. I mean, that's great to have that communication. But if I have it within my power to make you suffer for something that you did to me, and I decide to forgive you and let you go rather than punish you, I can skip the punishment whether or not you accept my forgiveness. I can skip the punishment whether or not you even know about my forgiveness. I can say to myself, you know what? I forgive them for what they did to me, and I can lay down my sword or my agonizer or whatever and just walk away, and that's it. The person I'm forgiving doesn't have to do anything. The person I'm forgiving doesn't even have to know anything. The power to punish them rests with me, but I forgive them. Therefore, I don't punish them. If they don't accept my forgiveness and I punish them anyway, I can't then say, well, hey, I offered them forgiveness. It breaks my heart that I had to punish them, but they didn't accept my forgiveness. It's not on them. I'm the one with the power. I'm the one who had the power to punish or forgive. I said I forgave, but I chose to punish. That's on me. That's not on the person who didn't accept my forgiveness. That's on me. But let's just say for the sake of argument that forgiveness does work that way, that it must be received as well as offered in order to take effect. How does God choose to inform people about his generous and merciful offer of forgiveness and salvation? By leaving behind no evidence to substantiate for future generations, or even for people of that current generation who weren't there to witness it themselves, that the act of atonement ever took place. And by leaving no evidence to establish that the God making the offer of forgiveness even exists. If I believed Christianity were true, I wouldn't find it astonishing that people still end up in hell. How many billions of people lived and died and went to hell never having even heard about God's offer of forgiveness? How many lived, heard about the offer, dismissed it for lack of evidence, died, and went to hell? What I do still find somewhat astonishing is that anyone would seriously try to defend the supposed actions of this God who creates a universe populated with thinking, feeling creatures, with rules such that every single one of those creatures will fall short and be sentenced to eternal punishment at the end of their mortal lives, then creates a loophole that would allow people to escape that punishment, then tells almost no one about it, and leaves behind no evidence that the story is true, thereby ensuring that almost everyone who lives after the creation of the loophole will still end up suffering forever in hell. That people stand up to defend that God and present him as the one deserving of sympathy and understanding in this grotesque play, not his helpless creations who are made to suffer forever for crimes most of them aren't even aware they've committed until it's too late. That is what I find astonishing. Even after seeing so many people do it time and time and time again. And now chapter 8, belief in God is dangerous. Orr-Ewing argues that atheists have moved away from debating the existence of God, since they weren't winning that argument, and shifted to arguing that belief in God is dangerous. Now let me just pause right there. I know it's early in the chapter, but let me stop right there, because there are atheists who argue that belief in God is inherently dangerous. I don't know if more atheists are making that argument because they feel that arguments against the existence of God haven't been successful. But if they are, the data doesn't seem to justify that shift. In 2014, here in the United States, the Pew Research Center released a survey of religious belief that found that the percentage of people surveyed who claimed no religious affiliation had gone up over the previous 7 years since they had conducted a similar survey the last time, as had the percentage of religiously unaffiliated people who described themselves as not believing in God. Orr-Ewing's home country of the United Kingdom was found by a Wynne Gallup survey conducted in 2015 to be one of the least religious countries in the world, with over half of those surveyed saying that they were religiously unaffiliated and 13% saying they were convinced atheists. And I will put links to both of those surveys in the description of this video if you want to look at that data yourself. Now, I have no idea if the declines in religious affiliation and belief in God is related to atheists arguing that God doesn't exist. But given that the declines are a fact, so far as we can tell, it doesn't really make sense to suggest that atheists are abandoning their attempts to convince people that God doesn't exist because they haven't been successful. for whatever reason, whether it has anything to do with atheists making arguments or not, and it may have nothing or almost nothing to do with that, but whatever the reason, religious affiliation and belief in God are both declining in the West significantly. Atheists and non-believers are still a minority in most places, although, as I said, in the United Kingdom, according to that one survey, they are a slim majority. But in most places in the West, they're still a minority, but they are a growing minority. The numbers keep increasing, and the numbers of religiously affiliated people keep decreasing. So if atheists are arguing less about the existence of God and more about the dangers of believing in God, it's probably not because they think the existence argument is a loser. It's probably because they genuinely believe, for whatever reasons, that belief in God is dangerous. It's probably sincere instead of tactical. There's no reason really to make a tactical switch from arguing against the existence of God, because fewer and fewer people are saying that they believe in the existence of God. So if that's a tactic that atheists are doing, that tactic seems to be working. Anyway, Orr-Ewing objects to Richard Dawkins characterizing God as petty and unjust, bloodthirsty, bigoted, capricious, and just generally malevolent. She counters by saying that the ultimate revelation of God is in the person of Christ, who was compassionate and gentle and concerned with the welfare of the poor. Orr-Ewing insists that she doesn't believe in a God like the one Dawkins describes, and she quotes Alistair McGrath saying that he doesn't know anyone who believes in such a God. Well, Dawkins' characterization of the Christian God as he puts it in The God Delusion, one of the most unpleasant characters in all of fiction, is based on his own straightforward, literal reading of the Old Testament. Orr-Ewing and other Christians insist that this is a shallow and biased misrepresentation of the God they believe in. And you know what? I take Orr-Ewing at her word that she doesn't think of her God as unjust or capricious or malevolent. But what troubles me is the unwillingness of many Christians to disregard or at least reinterpret passages of the Bible that depict their God acting in exactly that sort of way. If you're a Christian and I come at you with God is violent and God is vindictive and God is unjust, and to back that up I cite some divinely commanded atrocity from the Old Testament, and you respond to that by saying, oh, well, my church doesn't take that part of the Bible literally, or some other argument that basically amounts to those verses don't count, I can accept that. I mean, it sounds like a rationalization to me, but who am I to tell you how to interpret your holy book? At least it tells me that you recognize that the belief in God, that the belief that God is loving and just is irreconcilable with the belief that God ordered armies to murder civilians and capture women as sex slaves, or that God, drowned every living thing on the planet except for the occupants of one boat. But let's say you're a Christian and I give you the God is an evil monster argument, and I back it up with some Old Testament atrocities, and your response is something like, well, try to see it from God's perspective. Or the people God ordered slaughtered had it coming. Or the Bible tells us that God is just and good, so who are you to say that he did something wrong when he told Moses to kill all those women and children and capture the virgins so his men could rape them? Who are you to judge? Are you God? Or the old classic, his ways are not our ways. If you say that, which is what apologists like Orr-Ewing typically do, that tells me that you do believe in the God Dawkins describes, the murderous, petty, vindictive, grossly incompetent tyrant. You just don't like him being judged for his actions the same way a human who did the same things would be judged for theirs. Your problem isn't that people are accusing your God of things he didn't do. Your problem is that you think your God deserves to be judged by a different standard, or more precisely, not judged at all. Because who are we, the lowly creations of this mighty God, to judge him? And that kind of belief in God is potentially dangerous, I think. That unquestioning, dogmatic faith in a God who, according to your own beliefs, has been responsible for unspeakable crimes, who has presided over and occasionally been the direct cause of the sufferings of countless beings since the beginning of time, but who is righteous and just because he says so. Unwavering belief in an untouchable authority who has the power to judge you and punish you as he sees fit, but who you must never under any circumstances judge or question or hold to a moral standard yourself. That kind of belief, yeah, that's kind of dangerous. That can go some pretty unsafe places. There are, unfortunately, many times when atheists have conflated that kind of belief in God and all forms of belief in God, and that isn't fair. Not all Christians, for example, are so willing to accept that a loving God committed the atrocities depicted in the Old Testament because, well, he must have had a good reason. Many Christians simply refuse to believe that those things actually happened, and they interpret the Bible accordingly. Others are at least deeply troubled by the prospect that their supposedly benevolent God did all those things. It would be a misrepresentation to accuse all Christians of believing in and approving of the actions of the God Dawkins describes in The God Delusion. But it would also be a misrepresentation to say that no Christians believe in that God, because even when they claim not to, believers like Amy Orr-Ewing reveal that that's exactly the God that they believe in. Well, next, Orr-Ewing spends several pages arguing that it's unfair to label belief in God as dangerous when atheism has produced such dangerous philosophies as that of Nietzsche, who, as Orr-Ewing tells it, renders morality completely relative and subjective, with good being that which allows an individual to succeed and bad being that which causes them to fail. Quote, while looking ahead into the 20th century, Nietzsche predicted that following his death of God idea, there would be rivers of blood. It is ironic that atheists still call belief in God dangerous when this alternative, at least, is so potentially violent. The philosophy of Nietzsche could be every bit as dangerous and violent as Orr-Ewing says it is, and it wouldn't have any bearing on how dangerous Christianity, or indeed any form of God belief, is. To what degree you consider belief in God dangerous has nothing to do with the dangers of a completely different system. If I say to you NFL football is a dangerous sport, look at all the players who sustain concussions, and your comeback is, oh yeah, well how can you be such a pro wrestling fan then? They get concussions all the time too. You haven't refuted my argument that the NFL is dangerous. You haven't even engaged with it. You've just tried to change the subject. And that's what Amy Orr-Ewing does here. She brings up the question of, is belief in God inherently dangerous? And then she says, belief in God? What about Nietzsche? What about God is dead? What about atheism? Look at all of these terrible atrocities that happen because of that. What about that? Okay, even if all of that's true, you changed the subject. That's not what we were talking about. We were talking about belief in God and whether or not that's dangerous. And your response was, oh, what's that over there? Next, Orr-Ewing addresses the problem of fundamentalism. Isn't religious fundamentalism dangerous at least? After all, fundamentalist Muslims are responsible for violence and terrorism, so shouldn't we be equally concerned about Christians who take their Bible just as seriously as fundamentalist Muslims take the Quran? Well, not so fast. Quote, the contrasts between the New Testament, in particular Jesus' teaching, and the teachings and actions of Muhammad are startling. Jesus refused to be a part of any political violence and did not even resist his own arrest and violent death. Muhammad led others out in bloody battles, instigated the killings of opponents, and he wrote in the Quran the verses that still inspire Islamist groups today. Well, she's right, of course. Muhammad doesn't seem very much like Jesus at all. His behavior seems a lot more like another character from the Bible. Oh, what was his name? God. Orr-Ewing chooses to contrast the Quran with the New Testament rather than the Old Testament. And this is a wise move rhetorically on her part, since the Old Testament can be read in such a way as to justify all the same acts of violence and discrimination and oppression that are justified by certain readings of the Quran. And this isn't just an argument about the hypothetical consequences of particular interpretations of these holy books. Violence and oppression perpetrated by militant Islamists are frequently the subjects of media reports, but there are parts of the world where Christians don't behave any better. For instance, for the last 5 years, the Central African Republic has been the site of a bloody sectarian conflict that has seen the mass displacement of thousands of Muslim civilians at the hands of predominantly Christian militias, and there have also been numerous reports of massacres committed against Muslims by Christians, including one just last month where as many as 30 civilians were killed in the city of Bangassou. There have also been rumors of cannibalism of Muslim civilians at the hands of Christian militants. What about the Lord's Resistance Army? It attracted some attention in 2012 when a documentary about its leader, Joseph Kony, was released online, but it's been active throughout Central Africa for 30 years. Its leaders have been charged by the International Criminal Court with war crimes, including abducting children to act as soldiers. Though mainstream Christian organizations have denounced it, the Lord's Resistance Army is explicitly Christian. A few years ago in Uganda, you might remember this, Uganda, by the way, a country with an overwhelmingly Christian population, Parliament made international headlines by passing the so-called Kill the Gays bill. Though, to be fair, by the time it actually passed, it didn't establish the death penalty for gay people, just life imprisonment, so it was more like the Incarcerate the Gays bill. The bill was protested by many in Uganda and beyond, including many Christian organizations, but the supporters of the bill and the justifications offered for it, including the supposed evil of homosexuality, were also explicitly Christian. You might have noticed that all those examples I just gave were located in African countries. That's actually appropriate, I think, given how proud many Western Christian evangelists are of their efforts to reach Africa with the message of Christ, which, unlike that violent message of Islam, is inherently peaceful and loving. Orr-Ewing has even bragged about it herself in this very book. Let me take you back to chapter 4 of this book, where she writes, quote, "The average Anglican in the world is a female black African under 30 years old. This dispels the white, male, middle-aged misconceptions of the church that many people labor beneath. All around the world, whether in China, rural India, or sub-Saharan Africa, Christianity grows and spreads like wildfire. Yes, we're meant to be impressed by how quickly the Christian church is growing in Africa. But should we also use the violence perpetrated in the name of Christ by Christian terrorists in Africa against Christianity as a whole in the same way the violence of Islamist terrorists is used against Islam as a whole? Oh, no. Of course not. After all, no true Christian would do the things those so-called Christian terrorists have done in the Central African Republic or Uganda or Sudan. No, they don't count. No true Christian would do those things. Oh, and since that quote from chapter 4 also boasts about the church's amazing growth in China and India, I just wanted to mention the National Liberation Front of Tripura, which is a Christian terrorist group that has murdered hundreds of Hindus and abducted hundreds more, which was founded with support from the Baptist Church of Tripura, the largest Protestant church in India's state of Tripura. I also want to mention the Church of Almighty God, also known as Eastern Lightning, a Christian terrorist organization founded in China's Henan province, which has been responsible for inciting riots and beating, mutilating, and murdering people, a Christian organization. Now, should these terrorists be taken as representatives of Christianity in general? Absolutely not. Would these terrorists describe their crimes as being consistent with and perhaps even commanded by the God of the Bible? Yeah, probably. Might even say absolutely. Of course they would. So let's please dispense with this biased, self-serving notion of Orr-Ewing's and others that, well, Christian fundamentalism just isn't as dangerous as Islamic fundamentalism. Orr-Ewing describes Islamism, the ideology that seeks to impose Islamic laws through political and military power on just about everybody it can impose itself on, and also that typically regards non-Muslims with great hostility. And Orr-Ewing describes this political form of Islamism, and she says, well, Christianity has nothing like that. Quote, two things might be said here. First, to the extent to which fundamentalism involves intolerance of others, Christians reject it. Second, the act of merely returning to fundamental principles is, in and of itself, neutral. It may be positive or negative. One simply cannot adjudicate without first examining the principles themselves. However, it is especially important for Christians to respond sensitively to charges of fundamentalism in a culture where the two forces of militant Islam and rampant secularism are clashing. To the extent to which fundamentalism involves intolerance of others, Christians reject it. No, they don't. Not all of them, anyway. Some of them, many of them, to their credit. But undeniably, and unfortunately for Amy Orr-Ewing's position here, there are many Christians, many churches, members of the groups that I mentioned operating in India, China, and various nations in Central Africa, as well as right here in the United States, who are openly, proudly intolerant of people in other religions, people from other cultures, people of ethnicities that have been deemed unacceptable or inferior or subhuman, people of no religion. Orr-Ewing is only able to deny this obvious fact by denying that these people are genuine Christians. She claims for herself the right to define who is a Christian and who isn't. Again, she demands that we count the hits and ignore the misses. Christians practicing tolerance and compassion, well, see, aren't they wonderful? Living out the example of Christ. Christians committing acts of terrorism and murder in the name of Christ, oh, they don't count. Those aren't real Christians. By the way, does Orr-Ewing extend that same courtesy to Muslims? Because I have often heard Muslims who condemn the acts of Islamist terrorists say that those terrorists are not true Muslims. They do not represent the truth of Islam. They have warped and defiled the true religion of Islam. So does Amy Orr-Ewing accept that argument from Muslims condemning terrorism? Well, this is from a bit earlier in the chapter, but it's as good a note as any to end on, I think. Quote, last year, while speaking at the White House, I was asked by a West Wing staff member, our president said that Islam is a peaceful religion. What do you think? Here was a difficult moment. Having studied Islam, and militant Islam in particular, I found it quite awkward to answer briefly. I said, it is true that many Muslims are peaceful, and that some verses in the Quran encourage this in certain contexts. However, it is not possible to deny that other devout Muslims use violence as an outworking of their faith, and this is following their holy book and their prophet. We cannot ignore these facts. On this basis, I would not choose peaceful as a useful generic catch-all phrase to describe Islam as a religion. Is Islam peaceful? Oh, sorry, I don't think it is. I mean, sure, there are peaceful Muslims, but we just can't ignore the Muslims who live out their faith by engaging in violence. Is Christianity peaceful? Yes, absolutely. What about Christians who live out their faith by engaging in violence? Oh, they're not really Christians. Christianity is allowed to disown its violent, militant members. But Islam isn't. Is belief in God dangerous? Amy Orr-Ewing's answer to that is not if you believe in my God. But in order to get there, she has to ignore the people who commit unspeakable acts of violence and who are brutally intolerant of other faiths, who believe in the same God and take their inspiration from the same Bible as she. She has to ignore all of those people, and she must demand, if we are to lend any credence to her arguments, that we ignore those people as well. But unfortunately, as someone once said, I just can't ignore them. I just can't ignore those Christians. And on that basis, I suppose peaceful is not a word that I can use to describe Christianity. Well, that's it for Chapter 8. That's it for this video. I will be back in the next video to take a look at Chapter 9, which is called I Used to Believe, but I've Given It All Up, and Chapter 10, How Can I Know? And then that's it. That's the end of this book. Just 2 more chapters, and it's the end of the book, and it's the end of the series. So, thank you all, as always, for watching. Please leave a comment on this video. Tell me if you agreed with me or disagreed with me about something. Tell me if I made a good point or I made a terrible point or there was something I said that just drove you up a wall because you could have said it just so much better than I did. Please, please, please share your response to what I have had to say in this video, whether you are a fellow atheist or a Christian or whatever you might happen to be across the religious, ideological spectrum. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Also, please do like this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already, and please, please, please consider helping me to continue making these videos as well as all of the other videos that I make by becoming a supporter of this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel for as little as $1 a month. And believe me, even if $1 a month is all you can spare, it makes a tremendous difference. If you can afford a little bit more, like say $5 a month or even more, you can take advantage of some cool perks that I've made available to people who are able to go above and beyond in their support. One of the perks related to this series is that if you pledge $5 a month or more, you get a sneak peek at the scripts for these videos, which I post the day before the video goes up for the eyes of $5 per month patrons only. So that's just something to consider if you enjoy my work, if you get something out of it, and if you can afford to help me out and help me continue doing this and doing all of the work on this channel that I do, that I hope is of some interest and of use to those of you who watch. So thank you all for that. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.